500 years ago, these shores received their first European visitors. The Portuguese who arrived created the modern state of Brazil, promoted today for its music, dance, football, beach life. But this image hides a less appealing past. For Brazil was built on the back of the largest forced migration in history. North America is well known for its slave-owning past, but this South American country received 10 times as many, 4 million Africans. Why did Brazil become the world's largest slave-owning country? Why does it rank among the cruelest regimes of the past few centuries? Why is it a story that some still prefer not to tell?
Slavery is an inconvenient history for the Brazilian elite. There is no doubt about that. And they don't want this issue to be discussed.
In the year 1500, a Portuguese fleet, captained by Pero Alvares Cabral, set sail to round southern Africa en route for Asia.
Portugal was a tiny country. It only had a population in total of just over 1 million. So for them to send a big fleet was a vast effort. And Portuguese got to Brazil almost by accident. It was a large fleet on its way to India to get spices. And it was blown rather farther west than usual, and then they saw land birds, and they followed them and made a landfall on what's now Brazil.
The lands that stretched before the Portuguese were larger than Europe. It was a remarkable discovery, equaling that of Columbus only 8 years earlier. The Portuguese eagerly sent the news home to Lisbon. Lisbon, Portugal's capital, was the world's center of exploration. Its streets full of sailors, investors, traders, and adventurers. Only a few years previously, Vasco da Gama had finally worked his way around the southern tip of Africa and opened the sea route to the luxuries of the East.
Even though this people is the smallest of all the globe, that globe does not seem large enough to satisfy it. As soon as they have sailed along the coast, they take possession of it and consider it a conquest. Parmentier, French captain.
Cabral staged a mass on the shore of Brazil, and all the Indians watched and were quite impressed by it, because they're interested in seeing the ritual that these strangers had. In that first fleet, the Indians surprised the Portuguese by how open and trusting they were. A couple of Indians came onto the ship with, of course, no clothes on at all, and they just quietly went to sleep. And the only thing they were worried about was that their feather headdresses shouldn't get disturbed as they were sleeping. And then they were just quietly lying on the deck of the ship, totally trusting.
But that trust was misplaced. This new continent seemed to contain little obvious wealth. There were no gold-clad Aztecs or Incas to conquer. The only item of interest was a valuable tree, known in Europe as Brazil wood, which gave the country its new name. But there was nothing to compare with the wealth of Asia. Except for one thing. Its land. Portugal sectioned off Brazil's coastline to rich settlers, but they soon ran into a problem. Plantations are highly labor-intensive, and Portugal's own population was too small to send suitable emigrants. The ambitious new settlers turned to slavery. Portugal, like most of Europe, was no stranger to slavery. 1 in 10 of Lisbon's population was a slave, predominantly from northern Africa. So, all along the Brazilian coast, native Indians found themselves being bribed with their first iron tools or forced at gunpoint to become enslaved.
It's completely anathema to them, to a tribal Indian. They're communistic societies and they work for one another. And also the concept of overproduction is completely alien. They see no need for it. They're living in a very rich country with an evergreen system, so that the game is always out there in the forest and the fish are always there in the rivers. And so that's their supermarket. They see no need to produce too much and have it stored. And then also the concept of one man working for another man or woman is completely alien. It's horrible.
Conditions worsened. Mistreatment, physical assault, even murder. Above all, hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples died from European diseases, smallpox, measles, and the common cold. A plantation could see its workforce of hundreds reduced to a handful in a week. In years, a population of 4 million Indians was halved. So by the year 1600, the Portuguese, requiring an alternative labor force, had turned to Africa. Portugal had recently colonized southwest Africa, including modern Angola. Only 40 days sailing across the Atlantic, this was now to become, in effect, a people factory.
Angola was the area where most slaves that were taken out of Africa and landed in the American continent came from. People complain about the way that sheep or cattle are transported across the world. Transportation of slaves was very much like that. Perhaps 300 or 400 people packed together with only enough space to lie down, without enough air, without enough water, without enough food to survive. Very often, over half of the cargo, as it were lost from these voyages.
On board ship, in miserable conditions, the terrified slaves remain for weeks, months, and the great number of them who die is unspeakable. The Oliveira Mendes, doctor.
Many vessels, after they arrive, are abandoned from the impossibility of getting any person to clean them. Dr. J. Cliff, slave trader.
A ship enters from Angola and on a single day unloads 500, 600, or perhaps 1,000 slaves. The masters were few, the slaves many. The masters feasting, the slaves dying of hunger. The masters swimming in gold and silver, the slaves weighted down with irons. Vieira, Jesuit priest.
The Portuguese treated Africa as an infinite resource. So they just imported and imported and imported on the assumption that there would be the tap would never be turned off.
A man went around with a hot iron and branded us the same as they would the heads of barrels or any other inanimate goods or merchandise. Gardo Bakaka, African slave.
Almost every house in this place is a large warehouse where the slaves are deposited and customers go to purchase. When one was ordered, he came forward, threw his arms over his head, stamped with his feet, shouted to show the soundness of his lungs, ran up and down the room and was treated exactly like a horse. And when done, he was whipped to his stall. Walsh, traveller.
Gradually, by the end of the 16th century, the plantations build up their wealth, are able to afford to buy foreign slaves who are not going to escape as readily, and to replace the Brazilian labour that has been used hitherto. And so Brazil becomes the great slave-using colony.
What exactly were these slaves being used for? What was the commodity that caused the Portuguese to colonize these lands as quickly as they could? The answer is sugar. 5 centuries ago, this simple plant was among the most valuable items in Europe. Known since the time of Alexander the Great, sugar was highly valued as spice, medicine, and sweetener. In a world without refrigeration, anything that could mask the taste of rotting food could, literally, be worth its weight in gold. Plantations in Europe had been small and often of poor quality. The vast lands of Brazil offered massive opportunities. Huge quantities of processed sugar were shipped to ports like Antwerp, Amsterdam, and Venice. In 1598, a traveller in England noted how Queen Elizabeth's teeth were black from too much sugar. The cause of a queen's poor dentistry was the source of Portugal's new wealth. Sugar was Brazilian gold.
Ser dono de engenho de açúcar, para os valores do século XVII,
being a sugar mill owner in the 17th century was like being the owner today of 3, 4, or 5 oil wells.
Era realmente investimento.
People were making fortunes, huge amounts of money, out of the business of sugar.
Que havia no negócio do açúcar.
Slaves are the hands and the feet of the sugar mill owner, because without them, it is not possible in Brazil to set up, maintain, and develop a plantation, nor to have a functioning mill. Antonil, Jesuit priest.
We often tend to think of slaves just working in the fields, but obviously they worked as carpenters, as builders, and in various other occupations as well. They'd probably work from sunrise to sunset, sometimes 18 or 20 hours a day. It was said that slaves only needed 3 things: bread, cloth, and a stick. In other words, a stick to be beaten with, enough bread to survive, and just a strip of cloth in terms of clothing.
Throughout northeastern Brazil, sugar plantations sprang up. Over 200 such plantations provided the sugar that made Brazil the world's leading producer. Plantation owners often lived like lords. Their slaves lived less well.
E haviam senhores de engenhos que se tem notícia muito.
There are accounts of mill owners who were truly awful. Some even committed murder. All mills had slave prisons called tronco. And there were administrators who beat the slaves with stakes. And one of these, a palmatoria, which was used to hit the palm of a hand or the sole of a foot, depending on the slave's behavior. This is a small one. Others were bigger than this.
Eram essas peças aqui e maiores até do que essa. Com a escravidão, o homem passou a ser objeto, uma coisa.
With slavery, men became an object, a thing. And the master, the owner of this man, even had the slave's life in his hands and would suffer no penalties for any acts against a slave. For this reason, the slave was an object. He wasn't even an animal. He was simply an object. His owner could sell him, beat him up, or even kill him.
The system was barbarous. Punishments were severe, being placed in the stocks, being castrated, or execution. Most common by far was whipping.
By order of his master, he was stripped naked, tied to a stake, and whipped by the slaves André and Paulo. The master ordered the attachment of an iron neck piece and chain, and at the end of the chain, a tree stump weighing over 60 pounds was fastened. The victim was immediately taken back to the farm with orders to continue work. Toledo Lessa, public prosecutor. Whippings for 9 successive days are an ordinary form of punishment. The accused receives 200 or 300 lashes. The mangled flesh is then cut and pepper and salt applied to the wounds. The tourniquet, hand and neck stocks, thumb screws, manacles, irons, pillories, and many other instruments of punishment are common on our plantations. In some provinces, slaves are exposed for a whole night, tied to a stake over an ant's nest. Burlamac, abolitionist.
Não contam que o Barão de Cajaíba.
People say that the Baron of Cajaíba, who owned the Cajaíba mill near Santo Amaro, was a very mean master, a terrible master. He killed the slaves and was well known for being evil. One day, someone came to visit him and told him how attractive a female slave's breasts were. To please the visitor, as he was leaving, the Baron handed him the slave's breasts on a tray.
Todo mundo tinha medo dele aí.
Everybody was afraid of him. Here he controlled the entire area using these 4 mirrors.
Refletia.
One reflecting the other. These 2 mirrors at the front reflect those at the back.
Aqui por mar. E pelo fundo.
He could see the rooms around him, the gardens out back, and the river out front.
Ele reflete tudo quanto se passar aqui nas duas partes, para cá e para cá.
The Baron of Cajaíba was one of many who treated livestock better than slaves. Whereas in the United States the black population rose steadily, in Brazil, despite a far greater rate of importation, it stayed the same. Life expectancy for new arrivals was a mere 6 or 7 years, and slaves born in Brazil lived, on average, only into their early 20s. Why was there this culture of cruelty? In part, it was the particular nature of how the Portuguese sought to extract the most value from their colony. Few settlers brought their wives or families. This colonization was overwhelmingly single and male, and it was impossible for Portugal to discipline immigrants in such a vast area the other side of the Atlantic. Much of the population lived beyond effective control. And who were the settlers? Many were young men or ambitious gamblers, risking all, who found themselves thrown into a world of wealth, freedom, fornication. Many, too, were criminals or miscreants that Portugal preferred far from home shores. In an atmosphere lacking family, social or state restraint, slaves suffered. If the masculine nature of Portuguese settlement was one reason for the cruelty, another was economics. Although slaves were expensive to purchase, owners of lucrative sugar plantations soon earned a return. If slaves died through poor housing, inadequate food, disease, overwork, or assault, then so be it. There was no shortage of replacements.
When I asked the planter why the death rate among his slaves was so high, and pointed out that this obviously did him great harm, he quickly replied that, on the contrary, it brought him no injury at all, since when he purchased a slave, it was with the purpose of using him for only a single year, after which very few could survive. But nevertheless, he made them work in such a way that he not only recovered the capital employed in their purchase, but also made a considerable profit. Jardin, Doctor.
The natural increase of blacks is discouraged from the calculation that it is cheaper to import full-grown slaves than to bring up young ones. Brackenridge, Traveller.
The majority of imported slaves were male. Women were few, children not valued. The desire to raise families was diminished on all sides.
Slave women deliberately attempt to abort themselves so that the children inside their bodies will not be made to suffer what they have suffered. Antonil, Jesuit priest.
The need for slaves multiplied enormously when, in the mid-1690s, gold was discovered in the interior. Slaves were sent to the mines to dig, pan, and extract more wealth for their masters. Brazil's increasing prosperity was channeled into new towns and cities. As Portugal's population remained small, continuing to send few immigrants, and other Europeans preferred the cooler climate and Protestant faith of North America, it was Brazil's black slaves that built and serviced this urban